Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, God bless you. Happy birthday to you. And many, many more. At this time, Children's Church is ready to be dismissed. People together very quickly. One of them is mosquitoes. Everyone loves to hate mosquitoes. I haven't met a single person yet that's just overly infatuated with a mosquito sitting there biting on their arm, or if you go outside at certain parts of the weather here, they'll completely cover you. The other thing that will unify a body together is fear. Everyone has something that they are afraid of. And one thing that we need to remember is we're not alone in our fears. These children that just ran wholeheartedly to go into children's church have fears. They still have fears of the monsters under their bed. They have fears of being picked on at school. They have fears of disappointing mom and dad. They have very real fears. People in my age bracket have very real fears. We watch as mom and dads grow older, and in my case, we have a fear of not knowing when you're going to see mom and dad again, because there's that separation between them. And I remember one time going to Brother James and asking him, "Brother, this hurts. Do you have any words of encouragement or a prayer that you could pray with me that it stops hurting, because I can't stand this?" And he said, "No, brother. As a matter of fact, I'm going to pray that it never doesn't stop hurting." And I thought to myself, well, that's not what I wanted. But I understand exactly what he is saying now that I've gotten a little older. I pray it always does hurt to have to say goodbye, because that means that so much time hasn't passed that you've forgotten how to speak and communicate and love each other. We all have fears, every one of us. One of the other fears that I have is this side of the church, for whatever reason, is a deeper shade of blue than the rest of the church. And I haven't quite grasped why. But this shade of blue always reminds me of a recliner. This message will be hard to get through. But a recliner that was in a house, and I grew very close to the man that sat in this recliner the last months of his life. And one of the things that I acknowledged very quickly early on when I signed up to be his caretaker was that he was afraid as much as I was, but the fears he had were different. See, I was afraid of having to go over there one day and him passing while I was there, and then having to call the sons that he had and saying, "I'm sorry, but your daddy isn't here anymore." He had different fears because he didn't want anyone to be there when he passed away. And he didn't want anyone to look at him as a burden or a job, but he wanted it to be easy because he knew that he was going. And he was afraid for very different reasons. The one thing that I have acknowledged in my time here is all of us share that fear. We're either fearful of walking in and seeing mom and dad are no longer with us, or we are mom and dad that are slowly fading away, and we're fearful for our children when we do pass. We're fearful that our kids will make the decisions that they need to make when we're not here. We're fearful of being a burden on them, so we start doing things to try and help ease the pain, like buying funeral plots and deciding what our wills are going to be so that we don't have any financial burdens on our kids when we do get promoted prayerfully to be with the Father. And for those of us who still have mom and dad, we're afraid because we don't know when that phone call is going to come. We don't know when we're going to have the last Thanksgiving or the last Christmas, so we're afraid. And the one thing that unifies everyone, regardless of age, is we all have fear. And they're just they're just as personal in what causes us to be afraid as our relationship with the Father. They tie us together. Someone once told me that "do not be afraid" is written in the Bible over 365 times. Now, I've never opened the Bible and counted if that is true or not. But if it is, what a wonderful reminder that can be shared daily to not be afraid. But even if it was written in the Bible just once, we can count on the fact that we're told to never be afraid. Turn with me, if you will, to Isaiah 41. And let's look and see what is shared in Isaiah 41, starting with verse 10. Isaiah 41 and 10 shares this. "Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee. I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." Another translation of that verse of Scripture shares it this way. "Don't be afraid, for I am with you. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will hold you up with my victorious right hand." When I get afraid, my heart starts racing. Does yours? I start to get a little clammy, meaning I start to break a sweat, and I start to become overly aware of my surroundings, and any little noise will cause me to jump. And I'll start looking around and trying to figure out, what was that? You know, I'm not like some of those people in the scary movies where they want to go and investigate. I want to get away from it. I don't necessarily need to know what the noise was. I just want to get as far away from it as I possibly can. But the one thing I never want to do is get far away from God. And He tells us, when you are afraid, don't be. I'm right here with you. I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to forsake you. He tells us the exact opposite, doesn't He? He says, I'm going to strengthen you. I'm going to encourage you. I'm never going to leave you. I don't care how afraid of the dark you are, John. I'm going to be right there with you. I don't care what that doctor is about to share with you. I'm right there in that emergency room with you. I don't care what the prayer requests are that are unspoken, that cause us fear if they don't go the way that we anticipate them going, that we prayerfully want them to go. He's right there with us, isn't He? Never leaves us. I got tickled. Some of you noticed because I saw your smiles, but when Rowan came out of the choir, she didn't take my hand. As a matter of fact, she was defiant in it. She looked at my hand, looked at me, and just kept walking. And I thought, good for you. You be that strong young lady that doesn't need help. And some of the older women, truth be told, will look at me kind of crazy, but they take my hand and they get down. But she has very real fears. And her fears are no more unreal than mine. And the one thing, I almost kept the children during part of this service, because I want them to understand that when they get afraid, they can count on God. I remember whenever I used to get scared, I'd go running into my father's arms. I'd say, Daddy, I had a bad dream. Abby tickles me because whenever she decides to wake me up, usually she's sitting on my stomach and she's unhooked my hose. And I wake up and I'm suffocating because I can't breathe, and she's just smiling at me, and she's got my hose, my oxygen line, and she's just looking at me. And I'll say, you're killing me. And I go, ah! And she goes, ah! And she drops the hose, and I cook it up, and I grab her, and I said, baby, I'm sorry, what's wrong? She said, I had a bad dream, and I realized that I probably made it 10 times worse, because here I just yelled at her, she's crying. But the one thing that we all want is we want that person who's going to tell us, it's okay. I know you're scared, but I'm right here with you. I'm not going to leave you. I was out in Piggott early yesterday, and while I was out there, we had went to Heritage Park so the kids can unwind, and we had a picnic, and the one thing I kept hearing was gunshots. And I remembered because of my hunter friends that they had said that this was the beginning of youth hunting with modern guns. And we kept hearing gun after gun after gun. And I thought, my goodness, either one of two things must hold true. Either there's a shooting range right there by the park, or these young kids, they don't know how to shoot. Because the guns kept going off and off and off. But as I thought about that, it reminded me of a story that I had run across. You see, there was a father who was taking his young son to go hunting. And he had prayed that morning as he drank a cup of coffee, two things. He prayed that his son would be able to shoot his first buck. And he prayed that this would be the night that his son would come to understand exactly that God would never leave him. And so he took his son after he'd had his coffee, and they had breakfast. They shared some scrambled eggs and some bacon, and they had a few biscuits apiece, and they got in the Jeep, and they drove out to the property, and they got in the deer stand for a little bit, and they started praying for the wind to be uphill of them so the deers couldn't smell them. They prayed that the deers would be within range, so whenever they saw them in the scope, the young man could get his first buck. And sure enough, it didn't happen. But they had good talks in whispered voices, and they shared good memories. Well, as the night came, the father felt led to take his son to a stump in the middle of the woods. And he had told his son, son, it's time for you to recognize that God is never going to leave you. And the little boy looked at his dad with questionable eyes, and he said, Dad, what are you talking about? And he said, son, I want you to sit on this stump, and I'm going to take your gun from you, and I'm going to blindfold you. And I don't want you to take that blindfold off, no matter how scared you get, until you can see the first rays of light peering through the blindfold. And the little boy didn't want to question his father, but he was scared. He was tired. He'd been up anticipating the big hunt. He had very little sleep the night before. And he was so excited. But he didn't want to disappoint his dad. So he surrendered the gun to his father. And he sat on that stump. And the father kissed his head and said, I want you to know God will never leave you. And he blindfolded his son. Now the son, youth, is very afraid. Suddenly he hears every noise that's in those woods. He hears the breeze start to move those leaves, and he begins to let his imagination run wild. And he wonders to himself, is that a lion that's coming through the woods? And then he calms himself and realizes, no, I live in Arkansas. It's not a lion. But then as soon as he hears another rush of wind, and he hears the leaves move, he said, well, is it a bobcat? There are bobcats in Arkansas. So he starts to clench up, and he starts to listen, but he doesn't hear it. Well, then he starts to hear the beautiful rhythm of the night in the woods. He hears the crickets, and he hears the cicadas, and he hears some of the birds, and he starts to calm himself. But then he does hear some coyotes in the distance. And he thinks to himself, oh my goodness, here I am on this log. Dad said don't move the blindfold, but I'm really scared. I want to make sure that they're not coming. So he raises his hands, but then he remembers the kiss that his dad put on his forehead and said, I will never leave you, and neither will God. And so he pulls his hands back down, and he trusts. And eventually, as he hears all these sounds, and his imagination gets the best of him, just when he's about to surrender and take that blindfold off, he feels the warmth of the sun. And he peers through the blindfold, and he can see the sun's first lights. And he takes the blindfold off, and just across from him is his father with both guns, eyes bloodshot. And he realizes a very important lesson, that just like his dad, who was across from him the entire time, never left, neither will God. He's always there, watching us, ready to protect us, encouraging us, building us up. Sometimes our fears get heightened and our imagination runs wild. In talking with some of you, you go through great lengths to make sure that whenever you get ready to be promoted to heaven, that your children are completely taken care of. You let every request that you have made known so that the kids don't have to go through that. And you want your passing to be more of a celebration because you're no longer hurting. You're up there with the Father. You want the kids to reminisce in good times, in good memories, not the fact that there's just a shell of who you were lying in a box. You want it to be a celebration of your life. But you're afraid. You don't want your kids to suffer through the process. Look at it again. Don't be afraid, for I am with you. There's no parentheses that says that he's not going to be with you in the waiting room. There's no parentheses to say he won't be in a football stand when your child takes a vicious hit and slow to get up. There's no parentheses that says that he won't be there with you whenever your husband's a little late coming back from a fishing trip and you start to worry. There's no parentheses there that say that you don't know when you're going to have that major operation. There's no parentheses there that says he won't be with you whenever you don't know when the last time is that you're going to see mom and dad or the kids. He very plainly says, don't be afraid, for I am with you. And he goes on, and he says, don't be discouraged, for I am your God. 6 months ago, I couldn't have made that trek through the trails that we went through. I would have had to have stopped at some of those very carefully placed benches, and I would have huffed and puffed that you would have thought I would have been the big bad wolf in one of those little stories. But I made it because of prayer, because of my committees, my walking partners that keep me grounded and help me. My wife who says, do you really want this second plate? My fears of whenever I go in the doctor's office and wondering, did I gain weight, only to be told that I lost the weight. I didn't get discouraged. We can't either. We must remember that we're not to be afraid. We're not to allow ourselves to become discouraged. He goes on, he tells us, I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will hold you up with my victorious right hand. God bless the teachers. Amen. They have a special calling. And as I've been privileged to be able to work with the children in Corning and go into the school systems, I see a lot of things that they have seen. I see a lot of the kids who seem to be wearing the same clothes over and over again. It's not due to lack of wardrobe. It's due to lack of funds. So these kids wear pants that are basically falling apart around them. These kids wear shoes with no socks because they don't have socks. These kids, bless their hearts, they go to speak to you and you want to step back because they don't have the best of breath, but it's not because they didn't brush their teeth, it's because they don't have the toothpaste and the toothbrush. These children, they're precious, amen? They're God's kids. They're our kids. They're our nieces, our nephews. They're our grandkids. They're our grandkids' friends. They're people, just like you and I, with real fears, real anxieties, real problems. And they desperately want someone to tell them that they're not alone. That they don't have to be afraid. And the one thing that's very interesting is just like Rowan, they were very hesitant to allow me to get close to them because they've been hurt. They were very hesitant to open up and talk to me because they didn't know when the shoe would drop. But when they finally invited me in and we finally started forming those relationships, you want to know what the biggest singular thing is that causes most of these kids to be afraid? They're afraid that their parents do not love them. And it's heartbreaking and it's gut-wrenching. I asked one of the young children one time, I said, why do you think mom and dad don't love you? And they had said, because they don't acknowledge me. They don't spend time with me. I get in from school and immediately I'm given a chore list. And then I'm told to go to my room. And then maybe they'll call me for dinner if we have food that night. And sometimes I just lay in my bed and I wish I'd go to grandma's. My heart just breaks. They're afraid. And the biggest thing that bothers me is that they don't recognize that God tells them, I'm right there with you in that room. I want you to look and see what's shared in Joshua 1:9. I spent a lot of time in the emergency room the last couple of weeks, and one of the things that I thought really was funny to me, the person I was in there visiting was all bundled up, and they were tired of being in there. And the doctor had come in to give the report, and the person looked at them and said, well, it's about time. And I got tickled, and I had never seen this person this light. The doctor kind of looked at the person and said, about time for what? And they said, well, I thought you had forgotten about me. I was ready to go home. And I got tickled, and I thought to myself, well, this is a person who realized that they were okay, and they were ready to go. And they didn't need the doctor to tell them that, and they wanted to go home because they knew that God was protecting them and that God had already had this figured out. And whenever I was in the emergency room visiting that person, this verse of Scripture jumped into my head, and I want to share it with you. It says, have I not commanded thee, be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with thee wherever thou goest. Another translation shares, this is my command. Let's pause. This isn't a suggestion. This isn't him saying, if it pleases you. This isn't something that says, hey, if you remember this, that would be great. It's a command. You're being told to do this. And it goes on, it says, this is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. He was in that emergency room. He was in the car on the way there. Now, I have to tell you, on the way home, I was afraid. I had seen fog, and I had driven in fog. I lived right by the Gulf, so fog would blow in sometimes into Houston. But this was fog. And I got behind this car, and the car was going about 40 miles an hour. And I contemplated passing the people that were in that car until I started to realize that this was hilly area. And this fog was so thick that I probably couldn't see from where I am to where Brother Elmer is sitting. And I thought, maybe I just ought to follow behind this car and go. A trip to Poplar Bluff, you know, you've driven it many times to buy your groceries and whatnot, takes about 35 minutes, 40 if you're in traffic. It took us the better part of an hour to get home. But as I had rolled down the windows and was listening to that fog, I stopped and thought to myself, what if something had happened? What if I had suddenly gotten a flat? People, if they were trying to do what my mentality was of just getting home as quick as I can, would run right into me. And suddenly fear started to creep into this old city boy. And I thought, no, I can't do that. I just have to trust that I'm going to get home. Just like the person I was visiting trusted that God had everything worked out. And this person didn't share the fear and anxiety that the family did that come up to see this individual. This person wasn't afraid. This person never had doubt. This person just wanted to go home because it was past their bedtime and they wanted to sleep in their bed. Look at it again. Be strong. Be courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Wherever you go. My in-laws were on the way up. They encountered some nasty weather. And I got tickled because they had this big plan that they were going to come in, they were going to wake the kids up on Friday and tell them, oh, you're late for school, just see Nana and Papa. It was supposed to be this big surprise. And they were getting upset because they didn't anticipate this kind of weather. And there was red all the way from Little Rock up to us. And it was some nasty weather. And they made the very wise decision to pull over in a town I had never heard of and stay the night. Well, they were exhausted, and they didn't set their alarm the way they thought they had. They hit PM instead of AM, so I imagine whenever they woke up at their first rays of light that there was some great haste to get to that car. As a matter of fact, I recall my father-in-law sharing with me that, boy, your mother-in-law about drove me crazy on the way up here. She's not supposed to hear this part, so she's going to put her fingers in her ears. And I said, well, Dad, what are you talking about? And he had said, there was this man, and he had a duck boat that was behind him, and she just wanted him to go. He wouldn't pull over, and he just wasn't going fast enough for her liking. And he didn't know, of course, that he was blocking her from getting her grandkids. And she kept saying, Terry, will you just pass this boat already? And he kept saying, I can't pass him yet. It's a double yellow line. She said, there's no cops, just pass him. And he said, I can't do that. If we get a ticket, it'll be as big as my arm. And so when they finally got the chance to pass, they passed. But there was anxiety because they didn't think they were going to make it in time to wake those kids up. They were afraid that the entire plan was going to not happen because the kids would be up, and instead of the big surprise, they'd see him pull in, they'd see my dog go nuts, and it would all be ruined. But they never got discouraged. They never didn't think it was going to happen. They trusted in God to get them here safely. We have to remember we've got to do the same thing. We've got to always put trust in God. We must put trust in God. We have to know that even whenever things don't work the way that we want them to, and please understand me, there's some things that have happened that we wish didn't. I know there's a lot of heartbreak that has happened in this room. I know there is. I know that we wish that our children would have made a whole lot better choices than they did. I know that there's a lot of heartbreak in this room that unfortunately some of you have had. You've had to put to rest some of your children. And I can't imagine what that must feel like. I really can't. And I say this very respectfully. I pray I never have to find out. Because I imagine that's got to be one of the most gut-wrenching things that have ever happened. I know that prayerfully, many of you are hoping that you don't have to have that phone call that we all know is going to happen. That mom is no longer here. Dad's no longer here. I know for many of you, you pray you never have to have the phone call that something has happened to your grandchild. You know, we can joke about being afraid of the dark. We can joke about being afraid of dogs. We can joke, I went and visited somebody and they said they were lying in bed and a tornado would pass by and this person was praying and praying and praying. They looked at their husband and he didn't seem to have any fear at all. And she said, why are you not afraid? Don't you hear the tornado? And the husband looked at the wife and said, oh, it's up high. It won't do anything. And the wife was laying in bed praying and praying and praying. And suddenly she felt the house shift. And she said, is there something happening? He said, oh, it's up high. And sure enough, it went. But she didn't understand why he was afraid. I thought it was humorous until I realized that fear is the one thing that grips all of us. And we can laugh at fear after it passes. But when it's going on, it's very real. It's very scary. And it's the one thing that everyone in this room has felt is fear. I pray the one thing that follows that everyone in this room feels and knows is that you're never alone during that time. That God is right there with us. I shared with you one time that I'd wrecked my sister's truck and that I was afraid to call her. There was another phone call that I was very afraid to make. You see, I had thought that I was having a heart attack. My chest had blocked up, and I was driving to 1960 in Houston where I worked, and it's probably about the equivalent of leaving your house and driving to Jonesboro. It was a trek. And I was about halfway there, and my chest seized up, pain like I had never felt. And I had the symptoms that were described. My arm went numb. It felt like something was sitting on top of me, and I couldn't breathe. I just couldn't. And I was on a highway, and I had to try to figure out while I was going through this pain and couldn't hardly see how to get over to the shoulder to call for help. I was scared beyond belief. Now, I laugh because a lot of you think that you have traffic. You haven't seen traffic until, and Brother James can testify this, till you drive in Houston traffic during rush hour when the highways are 6 lanes each direction, and you've got 18-wheelers, and everybody trying to get into downtown Houston at the same time. I get tickled. If we all were smarter, we would stagger when we went into the city, but for some reason, we all leave at 7 o'clock. But I was in the middle lane, and I was trying to get over to the shoulder. I couldn't breathe. I was hunched over. I had to just drop this arm and drive with one. I couldn't turn on my turn signal. I couldn't hardly see out my rearview mirror. I just had to trust. And I saw my opening, and you thought I would have been a stunt driver. I sharped that wheel, and I thought that the truck had went up on 2 legs, and I went straight over, and I had stopped. I called Mandy, and I said, baby, something is very, very wrong. And she said, What is it? Because she was half asleep. You know, we're never alert whenever bad news happens. And I said, I think I'm having a heart attack. And she said, get to the emergency room. See, that phone call was very easy because she was still asleep. But the phone call that followed was fearful for all the wrong reasons. I was afraid to call my supervisor and tell them that I wasn't coming to work because I was afraid of the expectations of failing them, of being fired. I was afraid for all the wrong reasons. Family, we put way too much pressure on ourselves at times. We think that we have to dress a certain way. We think that we have to always have the house looking in tip-top shape. We think that we can't ever let somebody down or disappoint them. We think that we always got to be this little Mary Sunshine and Papa Light. That sometimes we put unrealistic expectations on ourselves and we're afraid to just tell somebody, I'm tired. We're afraid to tell somebody, no, I can't help you right now. We all know that person that can't seem to tell people no. And so they take on this person's problems, and they take on that person's problems while they're still trying to deal with their own problems, and they begin to become overwhelmed. We can't be afraid to say, I can't do it. We have to recognize that that person that is always with us, that says over and over and over again, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I will strengthen you. I will encourage you. I will pick you up with my righteous right hand. Is the person that we need to give all of this to. But we can't be afraid to do it. The last nightmare that Seth had, he came running and he jumped right at Mandy. And I'm talking, he barreled up enough speed that he knocked her over. And I didn't know what caused the nightmare, and I didn't care. And at that moment, neither did she. She just held him as he cried in her arms. And she said, I got you. And I came behind him and I tousled his hair and said, I'm right here. And his crying stopped, just weeping. And eventually his body, as tightened as it was, relaxed. And eventually the tears stopped and he fell back asleep. I believe God brought this message because there's something that you're afraid of. Maybe you recognize that the time that you have with your parents is drawing to a close. And there's some discussions that need to happen, but you're afraid to bring it up. Know that God is right there with you. Maybe your children haven't made the best decisions, and you're afraid of fracturing the relationship that you have with your child, so you don't bring it up for fear of angering them. Don't be afraid. God is right there with you. Maybe you're a child, and there's some things that you recognize that need to happen in your marriage. There's some things that you need to repair in relationships that you have, but you're afraid of going to that person. Don't be afraid. God is right there with you. Maybe there's an upcoming appointment with a doctor, and you're really nervous. The outlook didn't look so good last time, and they told you to come back within 30 days to see if this medication helped. And you're starting to dread it because you don't feel any different. Don't be afraid. God is right there with you. Maybe you're tired of going to bed alone at night. And you're just like me and you hear every noise in the house. And you can't stand this time of year because it's our bad weather year. And so you fear going to sleep because maybe you won't hear that siren. Or maybe you're afraid of going to sleep because what if you fall? And no one's there to help you. Don't be afraid. God is right there with you. Everyone in this room has been afraid. But I pray that everyone in this room knows God and knows that we don't have to go through that fear alone. Tonight, we're going to look at a situation where Saul was persecuting Christians, murdering them, imprisoning them, doing horrible, evil things to them. But God came, talked to a man named, forgive me if I say his name incorrectly, Ananias, told him to go to him. He was not thrilled at this particular juncture. He didn't want to go to Saul. But he did. He overcame that fear. We can do the same thing. Will you stand? Maybe you have never met my best friend, Jesus Christ. Maybe you have never allowed him into your hearts because you hide behind excuses like my life is still a chaotic mess. He wouldn't let me love him. He wouldn't come to me because I don't have it all together. I want you to know that that's the equivalent of saying I'm not going to go to a gym because there's overweight people in there. Jesus wants you at that exact moment. He will begin to restore you. He will begin to fix you. But you must accept him now. You're not promised tomorrow. I'm going to a funeral this afternoon of someone who thought that they had tomorrow. Of somebody who thought they had weeks, months, years. We're not promised tomorrow. Accept him now before it's forever too late. Listen to what you're singing. Really listen to it. Brother Elmer, will you dismiss us in prayer, please?